The cold didn't roar, it didn't snow, it didn't warn anyone, it simply waited for mistakes. That night, men stepped outside thinking it would be quick, just a short walk, just long enough to check the animals, just long enough to be wrong. By morning, entire herds were dead within sight of shelter, and strong men were found frozen where the distance should have been harmless. But one man didn't step outside at all. While others trusted courage and speed, he trusted something far quieter, something buried, something his neighbors laughed at all summer long. Because when the temperature fell past 40 below, the deadliest thing on the prairie wasn't the cold, it was the walk. And the man who removed that walk lost nothing. Part 1. The Frontier Setting. Out on the northern plains, winter isn't dramatic most days. It doesn't look dangerous. That's what makes it lethal. The land is open and honest, flat enough to trick you into believing distance doesn't matter. A barn 100 feet away feels close. A fence line feels like guidance. A clear morning feels safe. That belief has killed more frontier men than hunger ever did. On the high plains, wind doesn't need obstacles. It gathers speed for hundreds of miles, stripping heat faster than the body can replace it. Snow doesn't fall here the way it does in the mountains. It travels sideways, erasing depth, flattening shapes, turning familiar ground into a blank page. Men didn't die far from home. They died between buildings. They died where routine lived. Frontier culture prized toughness. A man was expected to move fast, keep his head down, and push through discomfort. Preparation beyond the obvious was often seen as fear disguised as labor. Build fast, build light, trust your legs. Most homesteads followed the same pattern. House here, barn there, short walk between them. No thought given to what happens when visibility disappears, when wind steals balance, when cold slows judgment just enough to make the wrong step feel like the right one. And every winter, the plains collected payment. Some winters were loud, others were quiet. The quiet ones were worse. Part 2. The man who didn't trust short distances. His name was Caleb Whitmore. He wasn't unusual to look at. Medium build, quiet voice. The kind of man people overlooked until they needed him. He came west, carrying less optimism than most, and more caution than anyone noticed. Years earlier, back in Minnesota, winter had taken his younger brother during what should have been a simple task. A short trip between buildings, no storm, no warning. Just cold air, shifting wind, and a moment of lost orientation that turned into a fatal mistake. Caleb never spoke much about it, but it changed how he looked at distance. When he claimed his land on the plains, he didn't ask how fast he could move in winter. He asked something else entirely. What happens when moving becomes the danger? That question followed him through every decision. Where he placed his house, where he built his barn, how he stacked firewood, how he planned water access. He watched the wind, he measured shadows. He paid attention to how snow gathered, how it drifted, how it erased lines men relied on. And that's when the idea took shape. Not a tunnel, he insisted. He hated that word. A covered passage, a protected route, a way to remove exposure entirely. From the back of his mudroom to the feed alley of his barn, just over 100 feet. Close enough to seem ridiculous, long enough to save lives. Neighbors laughed when the digging began. They said a man afraid of winter had no business on the plains. They said cold only killed the careless, and distance that short didn't deserve planning. Caleb didn't argue. He understood something they didn't yet. Winter doesn't kill the unprepared first, it kills the confident. And confidence, without systems, is just borrowed time. Part 1. The Frontier Setting. Out on the northern plains, winter isn't dramatic most days. It doesn't look dangerous. That's what makes it lethal. The land is open and honest, flat enough to trick you into believing distance doesn't matter. A barn 100 feet away feels close. A fence line feels like guidance. A clear morning feels safe. That belief has killed more frontier men than hunger ever did. On the high plains, wind doesn't need obstacles. It gathers speed for hundreds of miles, stripping heat faster than the body can replace it. Snow doesn't fall here the way it does in the mountains. It travels sideways, erasing depth, flattening shapes, turning familiar ground into a blank page. Men didn't die far from home. They died between buildings. They died where routine lived. Frontier culture prized toughness. A man was expected to move fast, keep his head down, and push through discomfort. Preparation beyond the obvious was often seen as fear disguised as labor. Build fast, build light, trust your legs. Most homesteads followed the same pattern. House here, barn there, short walk between them. No thought given to what happens when visibility disappears, when wind steals balance, when cold slows judgment just enough to make the wrong step feel like the right one. And every winter, the plains collected payment. Some winters were loud, others were quiet. The quiet ones were worse. Part 3. The decision they couldn't understand. Caleb didn't wake up one morning and decide to dig. The decision had been forming quietly for years, shaped by memory, by observation, and by an understanding most men didn't bother developing. On the plains, men prepared for storms they could see. Snowfall, wind, dark clouds rolling in. Caleb prepared for what came without warning. He knew the most dangerous winter conditions weren't dramatic. They were sudden. A temperature collapse, a wind shift, a calm day that turned lethal before a man could adjust his thinking. So when spring came and the ground finally softened, Caleb put his plan into motion. He staked a straight line from the back wall of his mudroom to the south side of his barn, just over 100 feet, close enough that neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. That's what made it funny to them. They gathered along the fence line, watching him break sod and haul dirt, and they said the same thing over and over. Why dig when you can walk? Out here, walking was proof of toughness. Digging was something animals did. But Caleb wasn't trying to prove toughness. He was trying to eliminate exposure. He understood that survival isn't about meeting danger head-on. It's about deciding which dangers never get access to you in the first place. While other men framed sheds and fixed fences, Caleb spent his mornings underground, moving soil one shovel at a time. Knowing every pound of earth removed was another layer of protection added. The laughter never stopped, and Caleb never explained, because the men who mock preparation are rarely interested in explanations. They're interested in results. Part 4. Frontier Engineering. How the passage worked. The covered passage wasn't deep enough to hide fear, and it wasn't fancy enough to impress anyone. It was built to function. Caleb dug just below the frost line, deep enough to escape wind, shallow enough to avoid collapse. He kept the ceiling low, forcing a slight bend at the waist, because warm air stays lower when movement is controlled. Every choice had a reason. The walls were braced with rough timber, set at regular intervals. Not because collapse was likely, but because winter stress doesn't announce itself until it's too late. Soil shifts. Frost expands. Systems fail quietly. The roof mattered most. Caleb laid heavy planking across the top, sealed it with tarred paper to block meltwater, then buried the whole thing beneath packed earth and living sod. Grass roots bound the soil together, turning the roof into insulation that changed temperature slowly instead of violently. Drainage was the detail that separated a usable passage from a death trap. The floor sloped gently toward the barn end, where moisture could collect and be removed before freezing. Water inside a tunnel is harmless in summer and lethal in winter. Ventilation came last. 2 narrow air pipes, one at each end, capped so they could be opened in calm weather and sealed tight when cold pressed down hard. Enough air to breathe, not enough to invite the wind inside. When the passage was finished, it didn't look impressive. That was the point. It looked like nothing worth talking about, but it removed the 3 things winter needs to kill you: wind, exposure, and confusion. And once those are gone, cold becomes manageable. Part 5. The calm that misleads. The day the cold came didn't look dangerous. That's what fooled everyone. The sky hung low and grey, but nothing moved fast. The wind barely stirred. Snow lay quiet and packed, the kind that holds your weight and doesn't drift. Men went about their work without coats buttoned tight. Children ran messages between houses. Livestock chewed hay slowly, breathing out soft clouds that disappeared almost instantly. Caleb noticed the details others missed. The air felt heavier, sound carried differently. Metal rang sharper when struck, the kind of signs you only learn after you've paid for ignorance once. Still, even he didn't rush. There was no storm to outrun, no wall of snow to brace against, just a quiet pressure settling over the land. By late afternoon, water left standing too long began to skin over with ice. Hinges stiffened. Leather lost its give. Men told themselves it would pass. Cold like this always did. What they didn't understand was that this cold wasn't passing through. It was settling in. And when night came and the temperature dropped faster than thought could keep up, the mistake would already be locked in place. Because the most dangerous moment in winter isn't when conditions are worst. It's when they still look manageable. Part 6, when the cold dropped without warning. The cold didn't arrive the way men expect storms to arrive. There was no wall of snow, no thunder of wind announcing danger, no moment when a man could say, "Now it's time to get inside." It simply fell. Sometime after sunset, the temperature began to collapse, not gradually, but in sharp steps. Like a ladder breaking rung by rung beneath your feet. Air that had felt heavy an hour earlier turned dense, almost solid, pressing against skin and lungs in a way that didn't register as pain at first. Metal answered first. Barn hinges let out short, sharp cracks as they contracted. Nails popped. Iron sang when touched. Water buckets froze through so fast that ice formed from the top and bottom at the same time, trapping liquid in the middle like a memory. Men stepping outside felt something worse than cold. They felt nothing. That numbness gave confidence just long enough to be fatal. Across the valley, lantern lights flickered as farmers made what they believed were quick trips. A few dozen steps, a short crossing of open ground, distance they'd walked 1,000 times without thinking. But the air had changed the rules. Breath crystallized instantly, coating beards and scarves with ice that grew heavier with every exhale. Wool stiffened. Leather lost its flex. Fingers stopped responding to commands, not because they hurt, but because sensation had already vanished. Wind, still barely noticeable, became deadly simply because it existed. Even a light movement of air stripped heat faster than bodies could replace it, turning short exposure into a race against physics no one could win. The first mistakes happened quietly. A man turned his head to shield his face and lost his line. Another bent down to clear ice from a latch and stood up disoriented. A third trusted the outline of a barn wall that had shifted shape under frost and shadow. Cold doesn't confuse you loudly. It narrows your world until only the wrong option feels available. By the time panic tried to speak, lungs were already burning, and thought had slowed just enough to make correction impossible. Inside sealed barns, another failure was unfolding. Moisture from animal breath condensed instantly, coating walls and rafters in ice. Ventilation closed too tightly, turned shelter into a trap. Automatic waterers froze solid, cutting off the one thing livestock needed more urgently than feed. Cattle can endure cold. They cannot endure dehydration. As night deepened, men realized they could no longer safely reach their animals. Doors drifted shut under wind-packed frost. Visibility dropped to nothing, not from snow but from darkness and the way extreme cold bends perception. Some tried ropes, some followed fence lines, some turned back too late. Every choice cost heat. Every delay stole strength, and that was when the truth became unavoidable. The danger wasn't the temperature itself. It was the assumption that a short walk would always remain possible. While the plains tightened its grip, Caleb didn't step outside to test himself. He stepped down. Under his house, a door opened into stillness. No wind, no sound of cracking ice, no urgency. Above ground, the prairie was turning routine into disaster. Below ground, systems were about to prove their worth. Part 7, when routine failed and courage made it worse by the second hour of darkness, men began to understand that the rules they'd lived by no longer applied. Routine had always been the anchor of winter life on the plains. Feed at dusk, water before sleep. One last check before turning in. The same movements, the same paths, the same confidence that familiarity would carry them through. That night, routine became the trap. Some men tied ropes from door to door, believing a line could replace vision. Others followed fence posts by touch, counting steps the way sailors counted waves. A few tried crawling, keeping their bodies low to the ground, where wind felt weaker. All of it cost time. All of it cost heat. Cold doesn't negotiate. It charges interest. The moment a man stopped moving efficiently, the debt became impossible to repay. Across the valley, lanterns appeared and vanished like dying stars as men turned back, lungs burning, hands already past pain and into stiffness. Those who reached their barns found doors frozen solid, hinges locked tight by contraction so severe that wood split under pressure. Inside, the problems were worse. Livestock crowded together, breath rising in thick clouds that froze instantly against walls and rafters. Moisture turned to ice. Ice sealed cracks. Air grew heavy and stale. What had been built as shelter became confinement. Automatic water systems failed first. They always did. Without liquid water, digestion slowed, then stopped. Hay piled untouched as animals grew weaker. Their bodies unable to generate heat without fuel, their systems could no longer process. Some cattle tried eating snow. It wasn't enough. Dehydration doesn't look dramatic. It looks like standing still, like lowered heads, like strength draining quietly away. Men stood at their doors, knowing what was happening and unable to change it. Every attempt to go back out felt like stepping into nothingness. Darkness erased depth. Frost erased sound. Even familiar ground felt wrong underfoot. Courage, the thing men trusted most, became the enemy. The harder they pushed, the faster judgment failed, turning back too late, taking just one more step, trusting the wrong outline in the dark. Cold punished hesitation, but it punished stubbornness faster. By midnight, entire operations were locked out of their own survival. Barns full of animals, homes full of helpless men, and a strip of frozen air between them that might as well have been miles wide. The plains had exposed the weakness no one wanted to admit. Their survival depended on a walk, and the walk had been taken away. While others stared into the dark, weighing risk against responsibility, Caleb never faced the choice. He had removed it months earlier, when the ground was soft and the idea still sounded foolish. Now, as confidence collapsed across the valley, something else collapsed with it. The belief that strength alone could carry a man through winter. Part 8. While others struggled, the system kept working while the valley above froze into paralysis. Caleb's world grew smaller and safer. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate. He followed a routine that had been designed long before panic ever arrived. Under the house, he opened the passage door and stepped into air that did not move. The silence was immediate. No hiss of ice, no pressure against the ears. Just stillness, broken only by the soft scrape of boots on packed earth. The temperature held steady, cool but workable, hovering just above freezing. Warm enough to breathe easily, warm enough to think clearly, warm enough to move without wasting energy. That mattered more than most people realize. Cold doesn't kill first, confusion does. Caleb lit a lantern and walked the length of the passage at an even pace, checking walls by habit, not fear. No moisture pooling, no frost creeping inward. The drainage slope was doing its job. The vents were sealed tight against the cold pressing down from above. When he reached the barn end, he didn't step into chaos. He stepped into work. Inside, the cattle were restless but alive. Their breath fogged the air, but the drafts were controlled. The barn wasn't warm. It didn't need to be. It was stable, and stability is what animals survive on. Caleb started with water. He broke ice slowly, not violently, knowing that shock mattered as much to animals as it did to men. Buckets came from the house through the passage, warmed just enough to stay liquid without stressing the animals' systems. He gave small amounts, often. Cattle don't need abundance in crisis. They need consistency. Then came feed. He increased rations, but divided them. Smaller portions, spread through the night, letting digestion create internal heat instead of overwhelming bodies already under strain. He watched how they chewed, how they shifted weight, how they breathed. Those signs told him more than any thermometer. Every 2 hours he returned, not because he was worried, but because the system allowed it. The most dangerous part of winter work had always been the travel, the exposure, the gamble. That gamble no longer existed. Above ground, men were forced to choose between risk and regret. Below ground, Caleb simply operated. Hours passed, then more. The cold outside deepened, pushing past limits men liked to talk about but rarely experienced. The kind of cold that steals sound from the air and turns time elastic, stretching minutes into something heavier. Caleb felt none of it. His effort went into care, not survival. That distinction changed everything. By dawn, while others counted losses they hadn't even seen yet, Caleb's herd stood tired but intact, hydrated, fed, alive. Not because he was stronger, because when winter tried to turn routine into danger, he had already decided where danger would never be allowed to reach. Part 9. When preparation made room for mercy, sometime late the second night, there was a knock on Caleb's door. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the sound of a man who had already spent too much strength just staying upright. Caleb knew who it was before he opened the door. The cold had a way of sending people toward whatever light still existed. The neighbor stood hunched, beard stiff with frost, hands useless inside frozen gloves. His eyes had the hollow look of someone who had made too many decisions in the dark and watched all of them fail. He hadn't come to ask about the passage. Not yet. He came because he was running out of options. Caleb didn't lecture. He didn't ask why the man had waited so long. He pulled him inside, stripped away frozen layers, and put warm water into hands that barely responded. Only after the shaking slowed did the truth come out. The barn was unreachable. The water was gone. The cattle were weakening fast. Most men would have shrugged then. They would have said winter had chosen its price. Caleb didn't, because preparation had given him something rare, margin, and margin creates responsibility. They didn't rush, they planned, they set limits, time limits, turn-back rules, rope between them so neither could vanish into the dark alone. Tools staged ahead of time, water already warming before a single step was taken outside. This wasn't heroism, it was controlled risk. When they stepped into the cold, it hit like a wall. The air stole breath instantly, clawing at skin and joints, but they moved with purpose, following lines they'd already agreed on. Turning back when the clock said to turn back, not when pride argued otherwise. Inside the neighbor's barn, the damage was already underway. Animals stood dull-eyed, ice-sealed corners. Breath hung thick and heavy, the air too wet, too still. The cattle hadn't died yet, but they were close. Caleb worked fast, not frantic. Small amounts of warm water. Ventilation opened just enough. Feed adjusted, not dumped. They didn't save everything, but they saved enough. And that mattered. When they made it back, both men were shaking. Not from fear, but from the understanding that without preparation, that knock on the door would have come too late. Caleb never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The passage under his house had already said it for him. Part 10. When the cold released its grip, the cold didn't leave all at once. It loosened its hold slowly, like a fist relaxing after it had already done the damage. By the fourth morning, the air softened just enough for doors to open again. Hinges groaned back into motion. Ice cracked and fell from eaves in heavy sheets. Sound returned to the valley, carried on a wind that no longer cut like glass. Men stepped outside and took stock. That was when the silence changed. Barn doors were dug free first. Snow shoveled away by hands that already knew what they would find. Inside, some animals lay where they had fallen. Others stood, alive but hollowed out, ribs showing, eyes dull from days without water. Loss wasn't dramatic. It was arithmetic. 8 cattle gone here. Half a herd gone there. Years of work erased in a single stretch of cold air that no one had believed could arrive without warning. Some families didn't bother counting for long. They already knew the numbers meant the same thing. Without livestock, the land was just land. No income, no recovery, no second chance. By the end of the week, wagons began to move east again. Men who had come west believing strength was enough now packed what remained, leaving claims behind that winter had judged unworthy of optimism. No one laughed anymore. They spoke quietly when they passed Caleb's place. They noticed things they hadn't before. The way his barn still breathed, the way his animals moved with purpose instead of exhaustion, the way smoke rose steady from his chimney, not frantic. Some asked questions. Others just stood there, hands in pockets, staring at the ground above the buried passage as if trying to see through soil and understand the months they had wasted mocking it. Caleb didn't celebrate. Survival doesn't feel like victory when you're surrounded by loss. But he understood something important as he watched the valley change. Winter hadn't chosen favorites. It had tested systems. And the systems that relied on courage alone had failed. The cold had taken what it was owed, and now it was done. What remained was memory. And memory on the frontier is what reshapes the next generation of decisions. Part 11, the lesson that outlived the storm. What stayed with the valley long after the cold was gone wasn't the numbers. It wasn't how many animals were lost or how many families left. It was the question no one could stop asking themselves afterward. How did a short walk become the most dangerous part of the day? The answer wasn't winter. Winter had always been there. The answer was design. Most people think survival comes down to endurance, to grit, to pushing through discomfort when things get hard. That belief is baked deep into frontier mythology, and it still shapes how people think today. But endurance is what you rely on when planning has already failed. Caleb's passage didn't make him tougher. It made toughness unnecessary. That's the part most people miss. He didn't prepare for the cold itself. He prepared for the moment when normal systems stopped working, when visibility vanished, when movement became risk, when help was no longer coming. That lesson didn't stay buried in the plains. You see it every time a modern system fails. When power goes out during a heat wave and people realize their entire plan depended on electricity staying on. When roads close in a storm and food access disappears overnight. When a simple commute turns into a survival problem because assumptions collapse faster than reality. The weakest link is almost never the obvious one. It's the step you assume will always be there. A short drive, a quick walk, a working pump, a clear road. Frontier men learned this the hard way because nature didn't care about confidence. It only cared about physics. Wind strips heat. Cold slows thought. Exposure compounds mistakes. Remove exposure, and most crises lose their teeth. That principle applies everywhere. If your safety depends on courage, your design is already asking too much of you. If your plan requires perfect conditions, it isn't a plan, it's a hope. Caleb's neighbors thought he was afraid of winter. He wasn't. He just understood that real preparedness doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring. It looks excessive. It looks like something people laugh at, right up until the moment they wish they'd built it too. And that's the lesson that outlived the storm. Not how to survive cold, but how to survive the failure of assumptions. Part 12. The quiet strength that never gets tested out on the frontier. Strength was never measured by how much pain a man could endure. That was something people said when they ran out of better ideas. Real strength showed up long before the storm ever arrived. It showed up in choices made while the ground was still soft, while the sky still looked harmless, while preparation felt unnecessary and even foolish. Caleb Whitmore didn't survive that winter because he was tougher than his neighbors. He survived because he refused to gamble his life, his animals, and his future on a short walk. He understood something most men only learn after loss. The most dangerous part of any system is the piece you stop thinking about. The routine you never question. The distance you assume will always be manageable. The condition you believe will never change fast enough to matter. Winter didn't punish the valley for lack of courage. It punished it for trusting assumptions. Caleb removed one assumption, and that was enough. His passage didn't make headlines. It didn't look heroic. It didn't prove anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But when the cold came silent and absolute, it turned chaos into routine and fear into work. That's the kind of strength the frontier respected most, even if it took time to admit it. The strength that never needs to be tested. The kind that looks like overthinking, right up until it becomes the only thing standing. If there's one lesson worth carrying forward from places like this, it isn't how to dig a passage or how to survive extreme cold. It's how to think. Don't ask how hard you can push yourself when things go wrong. Ask what you can design so pushing isn't required at all. Because when conditions turn unforgiving, courage fades fast, but systems endure, and the men who build them rarely have to prove anything to anyone ever again.